In the spring of 1569, in front of the Great West Door of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, a clerk of the Privy Council opened a wooden box, drew out a folded slip of paper, and read a name aloud. The crowd, standing in the rain, pressed forward to hear. The name belonged to a merchant from Lincolnshire who had paid 10 shillings the year before for a chance at a silver-gilt chalice, 2 yards of Florentine silk, and a small sum of cash from the personal treasury of Elizabeth Tudor, Queen of England. That drawing raised almost no money for the Crown. After the prizes were paid, and the administrators were paid, and the printers were paid, the Queen's treasury cleared an amount so small that her chief financial officer did not bother recording it precisely. By every conventional measure of public finance, it was a failure, and yet, 457 years later, the direct lineal descendants of that drawing generate more annual revenue for American state governments than the corporate income tax. In 2023, the combined American state lotteries collected over $110 billion in ticket sales. The states kept roughly $35 billion of it. That money is, in nearly every state that runs a lottery, the third or fourth largest source of revenue the government has, behind only the income tax, the sales tax, and in some places property tax. Nobody voted for it. Nobody marched for it. Nobody complained when their share went up. The citizens, in fact, lined up at gas stations to hand the money over voluntarily, and most of them thanked the cashier afterwards. That is one of the strangest political facts in the world. And it is the central fact of this video. The lottery is the only major tax in human history that the people who pay it actively want to pay more of. To understand how that happened, you have to look past the modern Powerball jackpot and back through 600 years of state finance, where a continuous logic links Elizabeth's London Cathedral to a 1964 New Hampshire horse race to the gas station on the corner of your street. And it starts, of all places, in a Flemish painter's studio that no longer exists. Bruges, in what is now Belgium, in February of 1446, a woman named Margaret van Eyck has been a widow for almost 5 years. Her husband, the painter Jan van Eyck, died in the summer of 1441, leaving an unfinished workshop full of pigments, brushes, panels, half-completed commissions, and 1 or 2 minor finished paintings. There are debts to settle. There are 3 children to feed. The income from her husband's commissions evaporated the moment his hand stopped moving. Margaret did what a small number of Flemish merchants and widows had begun doing in cases like hers. She advertised that the entire contents of the workshop would be sold by lottery. She set a fixed price per ticket. Anyone in the city could enter. The drawing would be held publicly at the Bruges Cloth Hall in the presence of the burgomaster and a city notary, and the holder of the winning ticket would walk out with everything. The drawing went ahead. The winning ticket belonged to a wool merchant from Ghent. He took the workshop's contents and left town the following week. Margaret paid the debts. The children were raised. It was not the first lottery in human history. The Han dynasty drew lots to fund sections of the Great Wall sometime around the 2nd century before Christ. The Romans drew lots at the Saturnalia banquets to distribute gifts among guests. Ancient peoples across the Mediterranean drew lots to allocate land, to select men for military service, and on rare occasions to choose victims for sacrifice. But the Bruges drawing is one of the earliest documented examples in Western Europe of a lottery operated as a private commercial transaction. Fixed ticket price, defined prize, public drawing, recorded outcome. Within a single generation, the cities of the Low Countries had figured out that what worked for a painter's widow worked for a town treasury too. Bruges itself ran civic lotteries in the late 1440s to repair the city walls. Ghent ran them in the 1450s. By the 1470s, the practice had spread to Antwerp, Brussels, and Utrecht. The merchants who organized these drawings retained a small percentage of the ticket sales for themselves. The municipalities took the rest. Nobody called it a tax. Officially, it was a charitable subscription with prizes attached. Practically, it was the cleanest stream of revenue any medieval town council had ever seen, because the citizens paid into it cheerfully. Across the Alps in Italy, the form was being refined at the same time. The Republic of Genoa held a remarkable drawing in 1505, not to raise money, but to fill 5 vacant seats on a board of magistrates. 90 nominees had been put forward by the Great Council. 5 would be chosen by lot. In the weeks before the drawing, Genoese citizens started betting in private on which 5 names would emerge. A merchant named Benedetto Gentile noticed this. He wrote a proposal to the council, suggesting that the city formalize the betting. The names would still be drawn for the magistracy, but citizens would also be sold tickets at a fixed price, allowing them to predict the outcome. The proceeds would go to the city treasury. Gentile's argument was not moral. It was administrative. The citizens were going to bet on the drawing anyway. The activity was already happening. It was already producing private profit for the bookmakers running it underground. The city might as well capture the revenue itself and eliminate the secondary problems of unpoliced gambling. It is, almost word for word, the same argument American state legislators would use 450 years later to legalize state lotteries in their own jurisdictions. The intellectual scaffolding of every modern state lottery sits inside a memo written by a Genoese merchant in the early 1500s. The council accepted. The Lotto di Genova held its first drawing in 1528. It was an immediate financial success. By the 1560s, every major Italian city was running a version of it. By the 1570s, the candidate names had been replaced with numbered tokens, severing the lottery from politics entirely and turning it into a pure numerical drawing. This is the form that survives to the present day. A pool of numbers, a small fixed ticket price, a drawing at a regular interval, a prize fund built from the ticket revenue with a defined percentage retained by the operating authority. Every state lottery currently operating in the United States is, in its mathematical bones, a direct descendant of the Lotto di Genova, which brings us back to Elizabeth, standing on the steps of St. Paul's in 1569. The English crown was broke. Elizabeth had inherited a treasury, emptied by her sister Mary's wars and her father's spending. She needed to repair the harbours at Dover. She needed to maintain a fleet. She needed to pay the men who had pacified Ireland. The amount of money required was not enormous by European standards. The political problem was that there was no acceptable way to raise it. English parliaments had spent the previous 50 years systematically resisting royal taxation. Elizabeth's father, Henry VIII, had broken the resistance once by breaking the church. Elizabeth had no appetite for a confrontation of that scale so early in her reign. Her advisors, including William Cecil, looked at the Italian and Flemish lottery models and proposed something the English crown had never tried before. In 1566, she issued a proclamation. 40,000 tickets would be sold across the realm at 10 shillings each. The prizes would include silver plate, fabric, tapestries, and a sum of cash. The drawing would be held under the supervision of the Privy Council, and every winning entry would be paid in full. The proclamation, which survives today in the British National Archives, is worth pausing on because of what it does not say. It does not call the lottery a tax. It does not describe the proceeds as going to the crown. It describes the drawing as a great lottery for charitable uses and the repair of harbours. The political genius of the document is its packaging. Elizabeth had invented a tax. She had also invented the linguistic framework that would allow every future government to deny it was a tax. Historians of Tudor finance, including Patrick Collinson at Cambridge, have noted that the 1569 drawing was not really about the money. It was about establishing the legitimacy of the instrument. Once the English public had accepted that the Crown could run a drawing without it counting as taxation, the Crown could run drawings forever afterwards, which is exactly what happened. Throughout the 17th century, Parliament authorised lotteries to repair Westminster Bridge, to finance the British Museum, to fund the Royal Society, to pay for naval construction during the Anglo-Dutch Wars. The financial historian Henry Roseveare estimated that Between 1694 and 1826, English state lotteries raised over £37 million for the Crown, equivalent to billions today. And by the early 18th century, the technology had crossed the Atlantic. The first colonial American lottery was authorized in 1612 by the Virginia Company of London. The Jamestown colony was failing. The settlers were starving. The shareholders in London were facing the total loss of their investment. They petitioned King James I for a license to run a national drawing to raise emergency capital. James granted it. Tickets were sold across England. The drawing was held in London. The proceeds were shipped to Virginia. It bought the colony perhaps 3 more years of survival. It was not enough. By 1624, the Virginia Company had collapsed, but the precedent had been set. For the next century and a half, the American colonies used lotteries the way other societies used taxation. They built roads with them. They built bridges. They paved the streets of Boston and Philadelphia. They built fortifications during the French and Indian War. They built churches in nearly every major colonial city. And they built American universities. Harvard ran a lottery in 1672 to construct a new building. Yale ran one in 1747 to expand its campus. Columbia, then known as King's College, was partially funded by a New York lottery in 1746. Princeton ran lotteries in the 1750s. The University of Pennsylvania, Dartmouth, Brown, and William and Mary all received lottery proceeds during their formative decades. Take a walk across the Harvard Yard or the Princeton campus today, and a meaningful percentage of the brick under your feet was laid with the proceeds of 17th and 18th century ticket sales. And then, in November of 1776, the Continental Congress used the same instrument to try to save the American Revolution. The Continental Army was in retreat across New Jersey. Washington had been driven out of New York. The Continental currency was depreciating so fast that soldiers were refusing to accept it as pay. Congress had no credit. The French were not yet officially in the war. Every conventional source of public finance available to the new government had failed. On the 18th of November, Congress passed a resolution authorizing a national lottery. $5 million was to be raised. Tickets would be priced at $10 continental dollars. Prizes would range from $20 up to $50,000. The drawings would happen in stages, the first in Philadelphia in May of 1777. Benjamin Franklin, who had personally organized several lotteries in Pennsylvania before the war to fund public works, was consulted on the structure. Franklin recommended that the prizes be paid in installments over several years, rather than as immediate lump sums. The reason was administrative cash flow. By staging the payouts, Congress could extract the maximum operating capital out of the ticket revenue before any large prize had to be settled. It was, in modern terms, a float strategy. Franklin had understood that the lottery's real product was not the prizes. It was the time between when the ticket was sold and the prize was claimed. The Continental Lottery did not raise $5 million. It did not come close. The runaway depreciation of the continental currency meant that by the time the drawings were actually held, the advertised prize amounts were worth a fraction of what they had been at the moment of ticket sale. The lottery limped through the war years, generating modest cash flow, and was formally wound up after the peace. But it had done its job. At the single most desperate financial moment in the early American Republic, the lottery had provided a stream of voluntary capital from citizens who would never have voted to lend the Continental Congress $1 through any other instrument. This is the principle that the next 2.5 centuries of public finance would confirm again and again. A government can take money from citizens through taxation and pay a political price for doing so. Or a government can persuade those same citizens to hand the same money over voluntarily in exchange for the dream of a prize that almost none of them will ever receive. The second method is almost always cheaper, and almost always politically frictionless. Almost. Because in the middle of the 19th century, the American lottery briefly died. By the 1830s, the lotteries that had built American colleges in the previous century had transformed into something the founding generation would not have recognized. Private brokers in New York and Philadelphia had taken over what had once been public drawings. Ticket prices had fallen. The frequency of drawings had increased. Daily numbers games aimed at the urban poor proliferated in immigrant neighborhoods. Fraud was rampant. Drawings were rigged. Prizes were not paid. Newspapers in Boston and New York carried weekly accounts of citizens who had been swindled by lottery operators who took the money and disappeared. The Protestant reform movement that had been building since the 1820s seized on the lottery as a target. Anti-gambling sermons were preached in every major American Protestant denomination. State by state, the prohibitions came. Pennsylvania banned the lottery in 1833. Massachusetts the same year. New York in 1834. By 1860, lotteries had been outlawed in nearly every American state. And then, in 1868, the largest single American lottery operation in history was chartered in Louisiana under the corrupt Reconstruction-era legislature. The Louisiana State Lottery Company sold tickets through every state in the Union, distributed them through the United States Postal Service, and paid bribes to state legislators on a scale that became a national scandal in its own right. When the Louisiana legislature debated renewing the lottery's charter in the late 1880s, the company's executives reportedly distributed cash payments to legislators large enough to influence an absolute majority of the votes. The historian Alwyn Barr documented the bribery in his work on Reconstruction-era Southern politics. The total amount the company paid out in legislative bribery over its operating life was estimated, at the time of the federal investigation, to exceed $500,000. Congress responded. In 1890, it passed the Postal Lottery Act, forbidding the use of the United States mail for lottery promotions. The Louisiana Company's federal charter was allowed to expire. Its operators relocated to Honduras and continued running drawings by international mail until further federal action ended that practice in the early 20th century. By 1900, the American Lottery, which had built Harvard and helped finance the Continental Army, was, as a legal commercial activity in the United States, dead. It stayed dead for almost 70 years. During that period, the underground numbers games persisted in black neighborhoods in Harlem and Chicago and Detroit. In immigrant neighborhoods in Boston and Philadelphia, the daily numbers ran as an informal economy. The historian Matthew Vaz at City College of New York has documented in detail how organized crime syndicates operated these games throughout the early 20th century. They had no legal existence. They generated enormous private wealth for the men who ran them, and no revenue at all for the public treasuries of the cities where they operated. The Harlem numbers operation in the 1920s and 1930s was, at one point, the single largest source of cash income in the neighborhood. The historian Shane White at the University of Sydney estimated in his work on Harlem street culture that at the peak of the Depression, daily numbers betting in Harlem turned over approximately $250,000 per day in 1932 money. A black businesswoman named Stephanie St. Clair ran one of the largest operations in the neighborhood and openly testified before the Seabury Commission in 1930 about police corruption that protected the trade. The numbers were illegal, but they were nearly universal. White New York could pretend the lottery had been abolished. Black New York knew it had simply been driven into the basement when the state lotteries returned in the 1960s and 1970s. One of their explicit selling points to white legislatures was that they would capture the revenue the numbers racket was already generating. The pitch was always the same. The activity is happening anyway. The cities might as well take the cut. It was the Genoese argument from 1505, applied 460 years later to 20th century American urban politics. Then, in the early 1960s, the state of New Hampshire ran out of money. New Hampshire had a constitutional prohibition on a state income tax and on a general state sales tax. By 1963, the state legislature had concluded that it could no longer maintain public services without new revenue. Direct taxation was politically impossible. Cuts to schools and roads were unacceptable to voters. A state senator named Larry Pickett proposed something nobody had taken seriously in American political life for more than half a century. He proposed that New Hampshire revive the state lottery. The bill passed. The legal framework was deliberately elaborate to avoid violating the Federal Postal Lottery Act. The drawings would be conducted at racetracks. The winning numbers would be determined by the order of finish in specified horse races. Tickets would be sold only at the tracks themselves. In March of 1964, the New Hampshire sweepstakes held its first drawing. It was the first legal American state lottery in the 20th century. Within 5 years, New York had followed, then New Jersey, then Pennsylvania. By 1980, 14 states had operating lotteries. By 2000, 37. Today, 45 states, plus the District of Columbia, operate one. If you are finding this useful, hit subscribe. We cover deep histories of everyday money like this every week. Now, here is the part that most coverage of the modern lottery skips entirely. Once you understand the mathematics of how a state lottery actually works, the political story stops being a story about gambling and becomes a story about the most efficient regressive tax ever designed by a government. Take a representative example, the Florida Lotto. A ticket costs $1. The player selects 6 numbers from a pool of 53. The winning combination is drawn twice a week. The grand prize, when it is not split between multiple winners, has an advertised value in the millions of dollars. The mathematical odds of selecting all 6 correct numbers on a single ticket are approximately 1 in 22.5 million. If a citizen of the state of Florida purchased one Florida Lotto ticket every single day of their life, beginning the day they were born, they would, on average, need to live for approximately 30,000 years before purchasing a winning ticket. The behavioral economist Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in 2002 for his work on judgment under uncertainty, has written that the human brain is structurally incapable of intuitively grasping odds at this scale. A 1 in 22 million chance and a 1 in 100 million chance feel, subjectively, identical. They both feel like maybe. The advertising teams at every state lottery commission understand this. The jackpot is always advertised in advertised dollars. The odds are printed in the smallest legal font on the back of the ticket. The ratio between the size of the jackpot number on the billboard and the size of the odds number on the ticket back is, in many states, somewhere between 500 and 1,000 to 1. The state of Florida knows this. The Florida Lottery Commission knows this. The legislators who approved the lottery in 1986 knew this. It is the structural foundation of the entire enterprise. Every dollar paid into the Florida Lotto is, on average, returned to ticket holders at a rate of roughly 50 cents. The other 50 cents is divided between the prize reserve, the administrative costs of the lottery, the commissions paid to ticket vendors, and the state's general revenue fund, most of which is earmarked by Florida law for the state's education budget. A direct 50% tax on the disposable income of working-class Floridians would be politically inconceivable. No legislator would propose it. No governor would sign it. No referendum would approve it. But a $1 ticket sold beside the cash register at a gas station, with the dream of a prize that almost no one will ever receive, generates exactly the same 50% extraction without political consequence. The citizen volunteers the dollar. The state retains the 50 cents. The transaction obscures the size of the tax embedded inside it, and the citizens this tax falls hardest on are, by a wide and well-documented margin, the citizens who can least afford it. A 2017 study from researchers at the Carnegie Mellon University Department of Social and Decision Sciences found that households earning under $20,000 a year spend, on average, between 3 and 4% of their gross household income on lottery tickets. Households earning over $100,000 a year spend less than 0.1%. The poorest American households are spending, in proportional terms, between 30 and 40 times more on the lottery than the wealthiest households. The financial economist Melissa Kearney at the University of Maryland has been documenting this differential in academic literature since the early 2000s. The pattern is consistent across every state lottery that has been studied. The lottery is, in functional terms, one of the most regressive forms of public revenue collection currently operating in any developed economy. It draws disproportionately from poor and working-class households. It funds public services, schools, parks, road infrastructure, that those same households rely on disproportionately. The result is a closed circle in which the poorest citizens fund the public goods the poorest citizens consume, while the wealthy contribute almost nothing through this particular channel, and the citizens lining up to pay this tax thank the cashier afterwards. This is what Margarethe van Eyck's Small Bruges drawing began in 1446. This is what the Genoese magistracy refined in 1528. This is what Elizabeth's London Cathedral established as legitimate in 1569. This is what the Continental Congress used to finance a revolution in 1776. This is what the Louisiana Lottery Company corrupted in the 1880s. This is what New Hampshire revived in 1964. 6 centuries of continuous evolution have produced an instrument that achieves something every government in human history has wanted, and almost none has managed. A tax that the citizens hand over willingly. A tax they line up to pay. A tax they thank the government for offering them. A tax that, in many states, the citizens vote by ballot to expand. That is the history of the lottery. The drawings are real. The prizes are real. The 50% that does not come back is real too. Every 2 weeks, somewhere in America, a clerk opens a tumbler, draws out numbered balls, and reads the combination aloud on television. The crowd, standing in front of their screens, leans forward, because the dream of the prize is the actual product the lottery sells. The ticket is only the receipt. If this changed how you think about the money in your pocket, the video on screen right now goes even deeper into another piece of financial history hiding in plain sight.